I'm David Henig. For the last 5 years, I've worked as the director of the UK Trade Policy Project for the think tank, the European Centre for International Political Economy. I'm also an advisor to the House of Lords International Agreements Committee and the UK Trade and Business Commission, among others. I focus on UK trade, UK relations with the European Union, issues around Northern Ireland, but I also look at global trade patterns as well, what's going on in Brussels. So really aiming to put into context what's happening in the UK in the global context. Because obviously we think we're terribly important, but actually in the context of the world, people have moved on to other quite serious things going on. Rise of major power politics between the EU, the US, China, and we're not really playing in that. So that's something I will come back to. I'm really going to look at, is UK trade policy maturing in four ways. I'm going to look at the free trade agreement agenda, which is probably what people would expect I think about when looking at trade policy. Relations with the EU, a whole side on regulation, because that's so central to trade. And then, the UK view of the world, as we might put it. And then having looked at that, I then go on to say, well, okay, what should UK trade policy look like? And finally circling back to and what does that mean for the UK's relationship with the EU? The summary of all of that is, in the last 3 months, it has matured, the UK trade policy. We do have more stability, but stability is, as I think I will argue, not can't really be the end result of what we're trying to achieve. I think there's a little bit too much excitement at the moment for the fact that we have a government that's not completely mad. One would think that was a basic requirement rather than something to celebrate. We'll come back to that again. Diving in, let's just start with the free trade agreement agenda. And this was going to be the big thing. The UK in control of our own trade policy, making customised trade deals that worked for us and that boosted UK trade. And it hasn't quite happened like that. We were already party to a large number of trade agreements as EU members, and with the exception of 3 of them, with Algeria, Bosnia and Montenegro, those were all replicated so that we still are party to those. Three down. Now, in the case of trade agreements with the likes of Turkey and Norway and Iceland, we used to have deeper relations and in line with being EU members. So now, along with the EU, we have more distant relationships. So we've replaced deeper relationships with our neighbourhood with a more shallow arrangement, not just with the EU. So there's that. And then we had these new negotiations with Australia and New Zealand, and those are set to come into force in the coming weeks, but they're pretty controversial. With Australia, it's widely regarded the fact that we signed up to pretty much anything. We didn't put any conditionality on Australia getting absolutely full access to UK agricultural markets, and we didn't get particularly much in return. With New Zealand are relatively a higher standard producer anyway than Australia. There's again a fairly basic deal. Net effect on UK exports, very little. Net effect on imports, potentially quite a bit. Probably not actually likely to have fundamental impacts on UK food production, but it might. There is a risk there. Both of them really agreed as a prelude to the aim to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, which is 11 countries, 9 of whom we already have a trade agreement with, the exceptions being Malaysia and Brunei, and negotiations are reaching conclusion there. So net effect of all of this on free trade agreements is that we don't have trade agreements with 3 countries that we used to. We do or will shortly have trade agreements with 4 countries we didn't used to. So that in aggregate is +1. which is not a dramatic change. We are in negotiations with India for a free trade agreement, but all accounts suggest that's not going terribly well. And then we're in negotiations to upgrade some, or at least slightly change some of them, with Canada, South Korea, Mexico, Israel, among others. But generally, it's not a very if you like, exciting picture. It's certainly well short of the promise of free trade agreements. Then again, the government has recently said that they've realised that we're running out of free trade agreements to sign as well, because there's no prospect of doing a free trade agreement with the US, because the US has turned against free trade agreements. They believe that they are not good for American workers and American jobs. We clearly can't have a trade agreement with China given the current political context. So we're kind of running out there. So a net +1 is probably some way short of the aim. Not only that, but since we left the EU is also net +1 because they've completed an agreement with New Zealand. So in effect, we've made no progress. Actually, we've lost progress, because of course our relations with the EU and the wider European neighbourhood are on a shallower basis now than they were when we were part of the EU and part of the same single market as Norway and Iceland as well, where we're able to have deeper relationships with Switzerland and Turkey than we are able to now. So if you like, a step backwards, but a sign of maturity, because the government has finally recognised that free trade agreement agenda is unlikely to be the be-all and end-all. And part of the reason is it's just a very outdated mechanism. It is a free trade agreement, essentially reduces tariffs. Well, tariffs are already pretty small. They're not the big issue in world trade. The big issue in trade these days is regulations, and they don't get addressed very much in trade agreements. Neither, in fact, does services, which is clearly our area of exporting strength. So free trade agreements are not a great match for the UK economy anyway. And we're running out of them to sign anyway. So yes, the government is recognising that situation, but it is a far cry from what the promise would be. But what I will give them a half a tick for that one, to say, is UK trade policy maturing in terms of free trade agreements? Yes, it is. What about the EU then? Yes, another half a tick for that, because what I think we've seen in the last few months is relations with the EU start what I think will be a long road back to normality. The Windsor framework over Northern Ireland is an important step forward in UK trade. A suggestion that actually we finally got over we don't really need a deal with the EU. We finally got over the strange ideas about how we can fix Northern Ireland. We've gone into a fairly pragmatic negotiation. We've roughly kept Northern Ireland as was before, but with some facilitations to goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. We've opened up the possibility to do what we should have done according to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, to accede to the Horizon Science Research Programme, which is very important for that UK community and probably the UK economy more widely. We also open up the prospect of doing more, for example, on financial services, on cultural visas, on various other things. So in terms of the EU, we've had several years where we were really in a poor state of negotiation. We had the idea afoot that if we stamped our foot very hard, we'd get everything we wanted, and we didn't. And we had various sort of performative walkouts and various very poor negotiating practice. We had several times threats of trade sanctions, and more barriers being put into UK EU trade. So it's a relief to know that we are now at some kind of point of stability with EU relations, but it's a low point of stability. We're exporting less relatively to the EU. If one looks at trade flows since we left the EU, in general, goods trade is up since we left the EU, as in global goods trade and trade from EU countries, and trade with the EU is not up. It's relatively flat. We're doing quite poorly economically. Companies are reporting plenty of barriers. There's plenty of trade still going on. It doesn't necessarily affect the export of Rolls-Royce engines or Scotch whisky or farmed salmon. We still have plenty of trade, but equally large numbers, particularly of smaller businesses, are finding their trade subject to a large number of barriers, no longer so competitive in doing business with Europe. So in a sense, we've stabilized at a pretty low position with regard to EU trade. It's also putting off inward investment. Inward investment figures are pretty disappointing. A lot of companies say, major international companies saying, well, why would we put a facility in the UK when it's harder to export to Europe from the UK than it is from any of our neighbours? So poor position as well. So stability, yes. Maturing, yes. Very low base though, from which we start. An awful lot of work that needs to be done. And talking of work that needs to be done, brings me on to the third area where I would say we need to measure the UK's trade policy. And on this one, it works out much worse, which is regulation. Regulatory differences are a huge part of trade barriers now, whether we have the same regulations for food and drink, how many checks there need to be on food and drink products going from the UK into the EU, for example, or on technical products, whether we're following the same standards and regulations. These are the essential barriers to trade these days, and yet we have the retained EU law bill still going through Parliament, even though every business, pretty much every interest group has said it's nonsense and it would do damage to the UK. But you still have a UK government and indeed a wider public that believes that divergence is a Brexit opportunity, just as it believed our own custom trade agreements were a Brexit opportunity. Now, the custom trade agreements have turned out not to be so much of an opportunity. It's probably going to be harder for that to happen, for reality to hit in terms of regulations. It's a sprawling topic, but what it will turn into is that there isn't really the benefit from diverging, because if we want to trade with the EU, companies are still going to have to follow EU goods regulations, for example, or goods and services regulations. So an example that's been in the news recently, if we may, on joining the CPTPP, eliminate tariffs on palm oil from Malaysia and have fairly weak laws on the link between that and deforestation. But any company that's dealing with the EU will have to assure that their palm oil has not been linked to deforestation in a much stronger way, according to EU law. And we're going to have to follow that, whether we actually follow the legislation in our own domestic law or our companies just end up following it anyway. I'm not sure, but ultimately we will be bound into that. For many goods, really, our producers want to follow EU regulations because that's the large market on the doorstep. That's known in some quarters as the Brussels effect, and indeed the EU want to go further. They want to actively set regulations in environmental trade, for example, the carbon border adjustment, so that if you're exporting products like steel and chemicals into the EU, they will need to have been a carbon price scheme in place. Otherwise, you have to pay extra for EU importers. The UK does in fact have a carbon pricing scheme, and almost certainly will end up having a carbon border adjustment mechanism like the EU are having, simply because if they're doing it in the neighbourhood, we are going to be under pressure to follow. So in that sense, but on regulation, no, we haven't quite got there yet. Still some way to go, but I suspect the retained EU law bill will be either amended beyond recognition or dropped by the end of the year. I think it's a case of one step at a time for Rishi Sunak. It has been sorting out the Windsor Framework in Northern Ireland, and now it's going to be dropping a very damaging piece of legislation that would put a coach and horses really through the entirety of UK law and massively increase uncertainty for business operating here. So we'll get there, but we're not there yet. So still some way to go on regulation. And on view of the world, again, we're back. A slightly more positive story. We finally got a government view of the world in which the US isn't the great saviour of free trade. There's a Brexit vision going back to 2016 in which the UK was leaving the protectionist and market distorting EU and joining together with the great free trading US, which didn't look particularly realistic in June 2016, looked even less realistic in November when President Trump was elected. That hasn't changed under President Biden. It hasn't changed that. Essentially, we are still looking at a US that's quite protectionist. For some years, the UK government held on to the hope that the US would sort of come to our rescue in some way, do a free trade agreement, stand up for free trade. It never really happened. In part, the world has been turning against free trade, as indeed did the UK in 2016, the UK public. And the government, for some reason, never really saw that happening. I think it has now. I think it's finally understood that the US is not the great saviour, and that UK trade policy is likely to align more closely with among the major powers with the EU than the US. That's going to be uncomfortable for this government, but they're going to have to come to accept that. There's a whole big picture then going on about there's a subsidy war going on between the US and the EU and possibly China for environmental subsidies. The US Inflation Reduction Act has brought that to the fore. There's all the EU regulation. There's a struggling World Trade Organization where the large powers are effectively slightly ignoring it, which doesn't have a fully operational dispute settlement system. There are pressures everywhere on the trading system, and for a now fully independent in terms of trade policy middle power like the UK, this is bad news. We do actually rely on a global trading system. We can't be bullying people like the EU and the US actually do in their trade policy. Now, I think we've understood that, but that's a long way from now working out what we're going to do about it. So where we are again, half a step forward. We've understood we need to think about a UK trade policy, but we haven't actually got to finding out what that's going to be. So, but fortunately for the government, if they want to read it, I have this paper that I've been working on for some time, building a mature UK trade policy, and that's got some ideas for what we need to do. Some of what's in that paper is a review of what's been happening, which is roughly what I've just been going through. And then some of it is more forward-looking and more contextual, what's going on in the world and how do we understand our place. And just to pick up then, what's trade policy for? How do we make this better? Well, trade policy is about growth, and clearly the UK desperately needs growth. But it's also about other policy challenges as well, and a large number of other policy challenges. So yes, we need a trade policy that supports an industrial strategy, as and when we have an industrial strategy. But we also need a trade policy that is cognizant of the environmental challenges and the low carbon transition, the climate emergency. We need to think about our own economic security, our own food security. We need to think about a visa policy, not just in terms of being nasty to people who want to come here, but actually in terms of those we actually want to come here to work. What about students? So Yeah, we need to decide what our balance is between manufacturing and services, or at least what we'd like it to be, cognizant of the fact that it's businesses that trade, not governments, but government needs to be thinking about that. So trade policy needs to be thinking about all of those factors. It also needs to think about fairness criteria, whether we should be doing trade or giving preferential trade to countries who don't sign up to labour standards or environmental standards. We need to think about how digital trade is affecting things. We need to think about our attractiveness to inward investment. So those are all the sorts of things that we need to think about in a trade strategy. It's a lot more complex than just let's just sign some free trade agreements. And when we're doing that, we also need to think, like, as I mentioned before, about the problematic global context. For the US, increasingly, it's decoupling from China, but actually it's thinking about decoupling from everybody. It wants to bring back manufacturing jobs to Michigan or wherever, whichever states are important in an election time. They don't necessarily want a World Trade Organization. The EU quite happy with the World Trade Organization as long as it can regulate globally for things like environment, protect EU industry. China is not necessarily wedded to the rules either. You've got in terms of countries, the UK is very keen on world trade rules because we're a trading country, much more so than the US. Even China did rise through trade, but it's hoping to have a different model, perhaps move towards the US model where there's more domestic production and consumption, there's less reliance on trade. So the UK has other countries that we talk with who are also reliant on trade, the likes of South Korea or Japan, Singapore, New Zealand. Many of these countries are or might be members of the CPTPP in future. The problem is they're not the ones who have great influence over the world trade system. They're not the leading powers, EU, US, China. They're not even the next most important powers like India and Brazil. So the UK finds the world trade system a slightly hostile place. It finds that countries wanting to sort of shut the door a little bit on our exports and what we should do about that. So that's difficult for us to as a context anyway, and that's a challenge the UK needs to face. So how then, given where we are and given that difficult context and what we're trying to achieve, how do we think about what the UK needs to do? And I think my starting point on that is that the first stage is there is actually an underpinning UK consensus on trade as to what the UK should be doing, which is that we actually do believe in trade in the UK, more so than many countries, but we also believe that trade needs to be fair. It needs to be subject to conditions. It's not completely unfettered like sometimes one thinks that the government, certainly the previous governments, were aiming to do. It needs to be fair with regard to environmental conditions or labour conditions. It needs to be subject to fair competition clauses. And I don't think the government has ever really put that forward as this is a balanced consensus view that would attract wide support. So pretty much the first thing you would hope for is to do that, and then to try to have that debate between all the stakeholders involved. Well, how do we flesh that out? How do we make that trade policy happen? What does it even mean? And I think, what does it mean? We want to be. We do believe open trade can bring prosperity. We want to be an attractive location for inward investment. But that trade is subject to rules. Our inward investors are subject to rules. We want to be part of global and regional supply chains. We want to be part of the European market. On the other hand, there is a limit to how much government can do to make that happen. Trade relations have to start with the neighbourhood. That's just an obvious an obvious factor. That it's easier to do business with your own neighbourhood in most ways. It's not entirely the case, but in most ways it is. Um, we need to align our trade policy with our regulatory policy, our visa policy, our industrial strategy if we have one, university policy, various other things like that. And we really need a government department that covers trade, that covers all of trade, not just world trade, and somehow divides off the EU. Um, and we need openness. We need a government that's actually talking to people openly, that's reporting what it's doing faithfully, that isn't regarding this as all some big secret that it has to handle. So those are the sort of principles that should be governing UK trade. But then there's a question of, well, what should a government do? What can a government do at the moment? And I said the free trade agreement agenda is running out. We've got them covering a considerable amount of our trade. And if you actually exclude the US and China from this, what you find is there's only about 6% of UK trade that is not covered by some preferential arrangement or other. So there's not much margin there for new agreements. Yes, you can try some new agreements. We can try to deepen some existing arrangements. We can try to remove trade barriers. These are all things that all governments try to do, and there's absolutely the things that the UK government should do as well. But it's not very, that's not going to make a radical difference, other than it is at least stability, and it is at least would at least be a government that business knew was helping. What you can then do, I think, is to start thinking, well, what about the UK strengths? What can we do to increase services? What can we do to increase our trade with, say, our top 25 trading partners, of whom about half are EU member states and around half are not? So how can we boost those trade numbers? So these are the sort of things that one would need to think about in terms of strengthening UK trade. And then within that, I think you need to look again at the EU. So how are we going to think about this EU relationship? Short of not getting involved in the debate here about rejoin single market or rejoin fully as members, I suspect none of that is going to happen for a few years. So what we need to do is to accept that they are our nearest neighbours. We are going to have to follow many of their regulations. There's a neighbourhood as well. It's not just the EU, and we need to target trade with them as well. But there's so many things that can be done to facilitate visas, to align regulations, just to remove some of the barriers that have cropped up. We won't get back to frictionless trade without being EU members, but we can help that process. We can sign up for various things, do various deals with the EU, and I think they would do them. I think that the Windsor Framework has shown the EU is prepared to do deals with us. And then beyond that, well, we're not going to get much, I think, from the World Trade Organization. That is struggling. We're going to have this globally quite difficult place, but we could try to use some of UK's soft power influence. Certainly we should be doing more to protect UK soft power influence, such as the BBC. Try to convene countries to get a more constructive environment for global trade. The UK needs to be a place of stability where inward investors wanting to set up know that there will be that stability. Perhaps we can't get that back immediately because of what's happened in the last few years with EU relations, but that is something that we're badly in need of. We need to be thinking through that industrial strategy very carefully as to think, well, what should the UK be doing? How can the UK take advantage of our strengths? Too often, I think, in industrial strategy, we think about the things we're not very good at. How about we think about how we can grow the things we are good at? And then the final thing that's in my paper is how we do all of this is how does government work with stakeholders in a professional way to create a single UK approach, rather than at the moment you feel that government's on one side and everybody else is on the other. And that's something else that we really need to work on. We've sort of somehow crept back to the kind of the gentleman in Whitehall knows best of the 1960s or something, away from what we know about modern policy making, is that it's a collaboration with stakeholders. But ultimately, trade policy, even EU relations, are not a nirvana for the UK. There are no simple answers that will actually deliver us huge leaps in growth in the future. We're in a tough world, and it's become all the more evident that we're in a tough world. What I think is happening is that we're losing our confidence we can even compete in that tough world, and that's understandable after 6 years of some really terrible government. We're starting to stabilise. So yes, UK trade policy is maturing, but it's not mature, and it's for sure not really got the scope at the moment to see how it's going to take us into the future, how it's going to provide the platform that we need for growth and tackling other policy challenges. So there's a long way to go, and I think that that's where I will leave this presentation. Is 3 months ago I would not have been confident that the UK trade policy was going in the right direction. I think it now is, but very, very slowly, and we're somewhat behind.